Well, hey everybody, this is Robert here, and welcome to the first episode of the Robert Harriman Show. And got a question for you. How and why has the government become so big and powerful and threatening to the average American? Do you sometimes feel like your freedoms and liberty are being taken away? And is this the same government the founders started some 241 years ago? Well, my guest today is going to help us sift through these issues. Please welcome to the show Dr. W. Calvin Fields III. Dr. Fields is the author of the book, The Hypnotic Communist, The Satanic Seduction of America. Dr. Fields, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Okay, well, the topic of communist infiltration into America is a huge topic, and it has a great deal of history to inspect. But before we get into that, can you tell my audience what you believe were the intentions of the founders of this nation?
Well, the intentions of the founders of this country were quite different than the country we have today. The original settlers, we know them as the Pilgrims, was really a family affair. It was families that came from England, and they had already been run out of England to Holland. And then they were run out of Holland, and the time was right, and so they got their ships and came over, and they thought it was a holy mission to settle a new country, which they called the New Jerusalem. And it's also been called what they thought to be was the shining city on a hill. And their hopes and prayers were that someday the rest of the world, which was largely slavery, would come to see this new example for human dignity, this shining city on the hill, and come to emulate. They thought that they were going to be the leaders of the new world. And the reason they thought that was not because of their own self-interest, but because they felt led by God. So they wanted to set the example, and that was the primary reason they fled Great Britain and Europe, to take all the risks that they took and all the hardships that they eventually experienced to try and settle this new world. And so move forward a little bit in time, and during the War for Independence from Britain, which became inevitable, King George was really a totalitarian dictator. They realized that the major problem with all other civilizations was that people didn't have a written constitution, and that human dignity was violated because power always tends to centralize in one location in a government that doesn't have decentralized powers. And so what they sought to do was to have three branches of government, primarily led by George Washington and others: the judiciary, the executive, and legislative, and each was intended to be a counterbalance to the others, so that no single branch or tree could collect totalitarian power of the government and become what I call communist dictatorship. Then the Constitution was written, and by the way, it was a very difficult process, and it was slow going. Then the Bill of Rights came along too, and the sole purpose of all this, the decentralization of power, the written down U.S. Constitution and Bill of Human Rights, were all intended to maximize individual freedom and dignity and minimize the power of government. The reason was, of course, that they realized that government that gets centralized always morphs, just drifts into too much centralized power, and it eventually threatens the people and tries to turn them into subjects. and this is what they're trying to avoid. And unfortunately, we have drifted too far from that today.
Now, what are some of the key historical events or documents that were used to infiltrate the United States and subvert our system with communism and communist ideas?
Communism came to the American conscience really in the late 19th century and early 20th century. But it really is a concept that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. I mean, it is a concept that was originally inspired by Satan. If you read the book of Genesis in the Bible, it talks about the fall of humanity after being seduced by Satan. And communism really is a satanic power. That's Satan's political party, if I may. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very old idea, but old ideas don't die. Ideas have a life of their own, and so they can exist for eternity. So the first experience that we had in relatively recent history would go back to 1642 and that time period, the time where Columbus came over and others, and the original settlers, the Pilgrims and the Mennonites and the others, first tried communism when they settled here. They tried community property. And so everyone owned the same land, and they tried that system, and their land was used for making crops, growing crops, and they tried that system, and it was a tremendous flop. The first 2 years that they grew crops, they just about died from starvation because there was no human incentive for any one individual to excel, to really be a steward of the crops. Social psychology would call this diffusion of responsibility. Everyone else thought it was someone else's job. And so after a couple of seasons, failure and starvation and even death, actually about half of the settlers died the first year. Mostly women, by the way. Women would lay on their children during the terrible cold, and they would actually be the ones to die, saving the children and the men. But then they adopted a free market capitalist system where individual property ownership was divvied up, and everyone else owned a part of the property, and so whatever he or she produced was his. And so the old human motivation of the self-interest of capitalism and being able to reap what you sow actually is what made the colonies successful. They immediately have a huge bounty of products to share, and so they never went back to the old system. And fast forward to around 1787 with the Constitutional Convention, where communist ideology cropped up again, because as the Constitutional Convention was going on, the ideas from the French Renaissance were starting to drift over into America, and too many of the pastors in the churches were actually considering and preaching about the ideas from the French Renaissance. They call it also the French Revolution, which really was a communist revolution in France. The problem with French Renaissance thinking was the premise was that mankind was inherently good. But the Bible teaches that mankind is inherently sinful, which is a much more realistic appraisal of human nature. And so the French ideology that Rousseau and others propagated was a false premise about human nature. And that's why communism, that's one big reason why communism catches on in the minds of gullible people, because they believe this. They believe that if you're just nice enough to people, that they'll eventually come around and do what you want. That just doesn't work that way. Just look at North Korea or the Cuba or the other communist satellites. And our policy of appeasement over decades has gotten us nothing. They've just taken advantage of us. Then fast forward a little bit more to around 1881, and communism manifests itself in the labor union movement. And the labor union movement started between 1850 and 1900. And I guess the most notable part of it was when the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, which became a part of AFL-CIO, in 1881, CIO, that the labor union has historically been the communist strongest front group for the infiltration into America. And that's when things really started to decay in our country, actually, was the late 19th century, because the labor union had a strict policy of anti-capitalism. They were always seeking more privileges, higher pay, better working conditions. And this was all going on as more families moved off the agrarian prairie into the cities. And this was also the very same time that Karl Marx was writing his theories of Marxism, or communism, which is what it was, in Germany. So things really started to heat up in the late 19th century. If then we go a little bit further down the road of history, we next stop at Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt's presidencies. This was Wilson was president from 1913 to 21, and then Roosevelt was president from 1903 to 45, which was the longest presidency of any American president. Actually, Congress had to make a law to prohibit that from ever happening again, because that in and of itself indicates tyranny. Woodrow Wilson was an academic, a professor. Unfortunately, I have to admit, since I was one too, although certainly didn't agree with his policies. People don't talk much about Wilson. They talk more about Roosevelt, but actually Roosevelt's policies capped off what Wilson did earlier, because Wilson really wanted to reorganize the federal government radically along communist lines. He was an anti-capitalist and wanted to centralize government, the exact opposite of what the founders wanted. Then when Roosevelt came along, he brought us what is much more familiar, the New Deal, which brought us policies such as welfare and the socialist security we have now, among many other socialist programs. And I must say that the welfare program has probably been the most devastating communist policy that America has ever had to endure, because it just has sapped the black community of their dignity and really put them on another slavery plantation instead of plantation owners. Now it's the federal government. It's heartbreaking for me to see that happen when it could be changed. Then we fast forward to the early 1960s, which was when I was a kiddo, and we see the Communist Party really getting much more bold, because instead of focusing on the legislative agenda, they began to focus on our country's culture, our social culture. I think this stemmed primarily from Lenin's policy of new economic reform, or new economic policy he wrote about. And that was the idea that you gradually or incrementally change the country's culture, and before they know it, it's become a communist culture, which opens the door very wide for all sorts of communist-style laws and restraints, centralized government, and so on. But the culture was being changed in the 60s primarily to degrade the country's morality. That was when the American youth culture was diluted, inundated with illicit sex and narcotics, drugs, youth rebellions on the college campuses, and all this was interrelated and organized by the common organization of the Communist Party with the specific intention to demoralize the moral fabric of America. It was instituting, instead of individual responsibility and dignity, they were trying to instill hedonism and narcissism, self-worship. I remember hearing the terms "do your own thing," and it was always about me, me, me. And the moral and public virtue was being destroyed. There was really a brainwashing that went into effect with the constant repetitive themes and memes about me, 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 and selfish self-interest, that people just wanted to get whatever they could out of society at everyone's expense. Then finally, my tour of history ends with 1963, 1962, and 1973. This was really the epoch, or the high point, if you could say, of the Communist Party's assault on America in 1962, when they outlawed the Holy Bible in the public schools. That really put the knife through the heart of America. And that in itself is a great study. How they did that, they said that they were not afraid of anyone or anything in doing that, except for the Christian evangelical community in the country, or the church. They thought that would be the only thing in their way. And as it turns out, it turned out well for them, because by then the church had been so demoralized already that they really didn't stand in the way. Then in 1963, following up injury to insult, or insult to injury, however you want to look at it, prayer was taken out of the government or public schools. And so our two most important weapons, the spiritual laws inherent in the Bible and putting God first in a culture, was outlawed. And that's exactly what Hitler did when he started to take power in Germany. Exactly what he did was outlaw the Bible and take prayer out. Then in 1973, really a terrible thing happened, where abortion on demand was legalized. And then that was pretty much it. With those three legislations in effect now in American law, then that really gave them a solid platform to move forward with the implementation of even more communist-style laws. And if you go on into history, bring it up to date to now, you can see that this trend has continued, unabated, unfortunately. And so here we are.
Yeah. So essentially, the communist philosophy is the antithesis of God and Christianity and the like.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is the opposite.
Yeah. So what do the communists actually want, in a nutshell?
In a nutshell, they say this in their documents. I've read their actual documents. I did for some 27 years in the libraries, on the internet. I've had students who were communists, exchange students. Their primary goal is the overthrow of the free world, which means they're focused on America primarily right now. They intend to overthrow the federal government by violent force. And they make a special point about using force. And, Marx harped so much, and the rest of them do too, which would include Bernie Sanders, by the way, that the overthrow of the federal government must be violent. And so now you're starting to see violence. Back, Ronald Reagan almost lost his life. I think it was 1983 when a certain individual, shot him, but he survived. And he was only in office 3 months when Mr. Hinckley attempted to murder Reagan.
It's 1981.
We see now, was it 81?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay, I stand corrected. Now we see Mr. Trump is in danger, and we see Mr. Scalise was an individual attempted to murder him not too long after Mr. Trump was elected. Fortunately, it looks like he's going to survive, but the Communist Party really wants to destroy the free world through violent overthrow, and they plan for there to be a domino effect. So if America falls, then all of the rest of NATO and the rest of the world will collapse, they believe. And they will use any means, legal or illegal, to do it, and they have no qualms whatsoever about any form of immoral or illegal methods. Matter of fact, something in their mind is legal if it advances the policies of the Communist Party. That's how they define illegal. Now, how do we define illegal? Well, because it violates common law that was constructed by Congress, and we all agree to it. We all appreciate what it's intended to do, to keep civil order, but that's not the way they think. People don't realize that they think so differently than the average American.
Now, one of the most important concepts that you bring to the book, and it's actually a subsection of one of your chapters, and you title it "To Cook a Live Frog, Warm Slowly to a Boil," which is absolutely so true. I've just never heard it said that way. So can you translate this to what the methodology of communism is and how it works successfully?
Sure. Well, it's called in the academic circles logical incrementalism. Academics always like to have bigger words, so it makes them sound like they're smarter, right?
Right.
But they think they know human nature, and to an extent they do. That Ivan H. Pavlov, the founder of respondent conditioning, was a Soviet and a communist. B.F. Skinner was an American behaviorist. He had a different type of method for controlling human behavior, and they're both true. I mean, they're both empirically accurate. I mean, they work in different ways for the same end to control and predict human behavior. But both of them agree that if you take many small steps, for example, if you legislate little pieces at a time, or change the culture small bits at a time, or modify the language that we use, the words that we choose to use to describe things, gradually over time, changing the words, but not the underlying premise, not the underlying objectives, that the public is too busy to notice what's going on. They have the normal human family has a nuclear family, a husband and a wife, and 2.1 children, right? And they're busy making a living and trying to enjoy the American dream, while these communists are doing anything but that. They just focus on plotting to do what they want to do, what they intend to do, the overthrow of the federal government ultimately. And so, for example, using different terminology at each step. For example, if we call something discrimination. Discrimination is one of their hypnotic terms that they use. They repeat it over and over and over for years and decades. Well, what does discrimination mean? To us, it means, well, I mean, the human perceptual system has to perceive the difference between the background and the foreground. Psychologically speaking, that's called discrimination. But they changed the definition from from that, to them, discrimination means what they think of as unfair treatment. But really, it's not even unfair, because in the communist mindset, it's fair to be unfair. Now, this kind of logic gives you a good idea for how they think. It's not the way we think at all. I mean, if you could look at an algorithm, I bet you'd find some real differences. That's a good research question, I guess. So anyway, so they change it. The welfare term, say welfare has been going on for many years because it was begun by Roosevelt. Then they go from welfare to Medicare. Well, it sounds similar, has a certain sort of ring, but they're very different ways of implementing communism, but they're achieving the same objective in a different way. It's called a different thing. It works in a different part of the brain, a different part of society. Welfare, Medicare, then what's next? Medicaid. Well, Medicare is for the older people, Medicaid is for the younger people. They both do the same thing. They degrade the morality and the dignity of people who really ought to work instead of receiving redistributed wealth from people without their permission. Then you've got affirmative action. Well, affirmative action came from equal opportunity. So you go from discrimination to equal opportunity to affirmative action, which is aggressive equal opportunity, then from affirmative action to diversity, which is expanding out affirmative action into culture, and then to multiculturalism. And you're doing the same thing. You're expanding out the sphere of influence of communist doctrine through these various terms. And so that's how it works.
Yeah.
For example, most recently we had medical marijuana, then we have recreational marijuana, then we have legal marijuana, and now guess what? In Colorado, marijuana cafes.
Right. So to kind of sum up what you're saying is, we could use healthcare as an example where this has been going on for decades. But if they tried to do this back in the 1930s, throw single payer on the United States, nobody would accept that. But they've just been chipping away into, to where we are today.
That's correct. Yeah, it's the same process with Medicare. And remember, the meme or the communist rhetoric during this process of legislation, when they passed it quickly, was hope and change. Well, I knew immediately who we had for the prospective president when I heard those three words, hope and change. Change is what communism is all about, hoping for change. Well, it was change, but you see, it deceived the public. The public thinks the definition of change means improvement, more prosperity, freedom, more health care, for example. But that's not at all what that administration had in mind when they put that out. So they are hoping that these exchanges would catch on enough and then collapse, and then assuming that the American public would be foolish enough to want to, where we are now, to vote in what they call single payer system, which again, that phrase is highly misleading. It's government health care, and government health care will never work because that's not anywhere in the Constitution. It can't work. The U.S. government, as controlled by the U.S. Constitution, has nothing to do with individual health care. That's completely outside the realm. So it will never work. And with the Republicans floundering right now, the reason they're floundering is they're trying to do the impossible. You either accept capitalism and the Christian religious foundation of it, or you accept communism and the Satanic foundation. So which do you want to choose?
Good question. Now, one of communism's most successful traits, and you've really alluded to this already, is propaganda and communication. Can you talk about how that is affecting us today?
Well, yeah. propaganda is not an uncommon term. It's been talked a lot about in the popular press concerning Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propagandist who was really quite smart in what he did. He used propaganda movies back during the beginning of the Hitler reign, and he was the first to use placards. We see people on TV carrying around these signs when they protest, quote unquote, out in the street. And by the way, the street is exactly where Karl Marx said all this should occur. He said we should take the streets and move on from there. This is all simply an application of Karl Marx's theories and all his numerous works. So Goebbels really documented just how well this propaganda works, because he did a really good job on the German people. I've talked with people, actually one person in particular, about the experience in Germany during the war, and she said they didn't know. And that question has puzzled me for a long time. How can that be? How could you not know? Well, Hitler really deceived the public. He changed the street signs. He completely deceived the public. He eventually moved the Jews into a separate area, even away from the German population, so they could be more easily picked up. When the time came, there were Jewish slums. But he did it all through hypnotic conditioning, through repetitive propaganda. And part of the legacy, believe it or not, in America that's changed us is NASA. National Aeronautics and Space Administration came originally from the Nazis with the Goddard rocket. Their rocket program, which they were ahead of us during World War II, actually was the beginning of what we now call NASA. So who went to the moon? Was it us or the Germans? Also, the current gun laws we have violate the U.S. Constitution. There should be no limits on individual carry for pistols or revolvers or long guns, and yet we have a really qualified gun law where you need to get a license to carry your own weapon. This again came from the program that Adolf Hitler forced it on the Jews just prior to what we call Glasnost. Not Glasnost, what's it called? It was the night of the breaking glass, where he sent out the Gestapo and the brown shirts to destroy the Jewish businesses. They would break the glass, throw bricks through and run off the proprietors and then arrest them. And just prior to that, he installed this gun control program where everybody had to register their gun with the secret police. And so by doing that, that was a false, that was a fake thing, because what they really were doing was registering the people that had the guns so they knew who had the guns. So later on, after the night of the breaking glass, then they could find out who had their weapons and arrest them, or even prior to that,
and
confiscate them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then arrest the person that had the gun, and that was the beginning of the concentration camps. So today, the language that the communists use has really been the most successful way of manipulating the American public. It's called dialectical materialism. It's the dialect of the communist lingo, if I may, that there's a thing called the Whorf hypothesis, W-H-O-R-F, I think how it's spelled, and it says that, thoughts influence behaviors, but behaviors influence thoughts too. It's a circular effect. Mm-hmm. They reinforce each other. And the Whorf hypothesis says that the words we choose to use influence how we think. So the communists know about this, and so they have this really prevalent, it's almost choking program in this country to manipulate words and language to get people to think differently, to think along Communist Party lines. So the most common, their favorite word is one I guess you've never heard. It's called racism. And everybody's heard this because they repeat it so many times. And so people, just by the sheer repetition of the thousands and thousands of times you hear it in all these different contexts, people start, a lot of people, too many people, start believing, well, there must be racism. You know, their subconscious mind eventually gets overwhelmed where their conscious rational mind, the part of the mind that analyzes and critically evaluates things, gets overwhelmed by the subconscious mind, and the subconscious mind sort of takes over and overrides the conscious mind. And so because of this systematic, continual pounding on the subconscious mind with all these different communist terms, these different dialectical terms, we have a changed language, we have changed culture, changed values, changed behavior, and, for example, at the voting booth, we have changed decisions. And because it's so demoralized, the American morality and virtue, we have a higher murder rate, which began in the 1960s. They just shot up. We have abortions is skyrocketed. Illegitimacy rates, have skyrocketed. Welfare has increased dramatically. And all of these things spiked in the early 1962, right after prayer and the Bible was taken out of education process. So eventually, if people don't love freedom and know their constitutional values, then this constant repetition of these terms they want us to accept and believe in degrades the moral foundation of a country. Instead of an absolute morality where right is right and wrong is wrong, the people begin to accept a relative morality, right, where it's sort of like, well, it's true for you, but maybe not for me, kind of thing, where there is no absolute truth. If there is no absolute truth, then the gate's completely wide open for anything to pose as truth, even though it's not, and everyone's supposed to believe it. So then that opens the door for all the communist lies to go on, and communist is nothing but a long string of lies. And so that, to me, explains how America has really been seduced over a period of decades.
Okay, I'm speaking to Dr. W. Calvin Fields III, the author of the book, The Hypnotic Communist, The Satanic Seduction of America. And your book, Dr. Fields, is peppered with connections between the Democratic Party and communism. Can you explain how you came to this conclusion? And why did you leave out the Republicans? Because there's a lot of right socialists in the Congress today. So
don't worry about that. I got it covered.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's an uncomfortable truth that we have to accept and to deal with, because you're right. By the way, the Democratic Party and the Communist Party are not connected. They're one and the same. And that's something that we're still in denial over that, and people just will not talk about it. And that was the main reason I wrote the book. If I could say there was a main reason, was because I knew enough, having lived in the academy as a professor for about 20 years, that it is a giant communist front organization. All the universities, whether they call themselves public or private, Christian or secular, I can only think of maybe one or two that might not be. The Democrat Party is the false label for the Communist Party. And that's another way that they're manipulating the public, by hiding behind that communist dialect. dialectical term. So when I was working, I started to notice things. I started to see that things were not exactly right. I'm an evangelical Christian, having been converted December 31st, 1973, and so I probably smelled quite different than the rest of the people in the academy, in my department, in the school. They were so alert, their antennas are so alert to any kind of conservative or Christian ideology, or even any ideology that wants to seek the truth, that their antenna shoots up really fast when you start telling the students what they really need to know. For example, if China is a communist country, which fell in 1949 to the Communist Party, why would America want to trade with the country that has no intention of being honest in trade? Why would we, when we have to factor in the cost of labor into our product production, trade with a country that doesn't? The communist countries have slaves to do all their production. They either do what the party says or they're punished. What if we got into a fighting war with North Korea? And guess what? Some of the electronics are made in China for F-18s or F-35s. Would we continue to get sensors for the replacement parts, you think? I don't think so. The language and political platforms of the two parties are very obvious if you listen to what goes on among the parties. The Democratic Party has the same platform and the same goals and the same language as the Communist Party USA. If you don't believe me, go to the Liberal Caucus. They have a site for the Liberal Caucus in the Democrat Party, and those are the primary leadership of the Communist Party in the Democrat Party. Then go to the CommunistPartyUSA.com website and compare the language and the agendas and their topics and issues that both segments purport. You'll find the subjects are virtually exactly the same, even the wording, the tone are all the same. And I was trained I was an unusual business school student in that I did my dissertation as a qualitative analysis of the Financial and Accounting Standards Board. And that's when I learned to use content analysis to analyze language. And I can tell you authoritatively that there's no doubt whatsoever that because of the same language, the same worldview is present between the Communist and Democratic Party, they are synonymous. And they hide within the Democrat Party because if the country knew that they were voting for the Communist Party when they pulled that lever to vote for a Democrat, I think that would probably reduce the head count a lot. I don't think communism still has a bad image in America. A lot of people laugh at it. They think it's a joke. And by the way, that's another symptom of hypnotic conditioning, to laugh at it, because that hypnotic program began in about the 30s. They realized that the public was catching on too much to what they were really up to, and so they conditioned the public to think it was a joke, that it was just funny and not real. And that same kind of reaction you can see today in people when you say, for example, the other day I said CNN was the Communist Party, Communist Network, and people laughed. Communist News Network. People laughed. Well, it does sound kind of funny if you don't know the truth, but if you know the truth, it's anything but funny. CNN is also red, and the traditional color of the Communist Party is red. Chris Matthews, back in the late 90s, another journalist, changed the color of the Communist Party to blue, and flip-flop the color of the Republican Party to red. Now, why do you think they did that? Well, it was to confuse the electorate, to get them to think, well, if they vote blue, they're voting Republican in their subconscious mind, but actually they should be rational and realize, whoops, they flipped it, I need to vote red now. So that's just another example of how they try to manipulate and confuse the American mind. So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, anyway, I've got all these qualitative categories, and then if I was going to use and continue with this research, I would build the content categories up from construct analysis to discriminant analysis. I'd do a cluster analysis on the data, which is a statistical process, develop content valid categories, develop convergent validity, and then generate some statistics for predictive validity, and then you'd be off into hardcore empirical research. And I promise you it could be done. It's just that another reason I did this was to lay the groundwork for future research. You want to make sure that you have good definitions of your constructs, your good definitions of your concepts, so that when people that want to pursue the more empirical work, it can provide much greater evidence for my theory, my contention, then they'll be able to do so.
Okay, well, Dr. Fields, I'm getting short on time here. Now, if someone is interested in checking out your book, The Hypnotic Communist, the Satanic Seduction of America, where can they find it?
I would recommend the best place to go would be my own website, thehypnoticcommunist.com. And there's dashes between the and hypnotic and between hypnotic and communist, although I think it'll probably come up okay if you just type in the original term. And two reasons why it'd be better to go there than Amazon, which you could go there too, is number one, you will save a few dollars because I will send it out to you directly. And number two, you'll probably get it faster through the United Postal Service, probably 4 days, whereas Amazon, it could be a week.
Okay, great. It was an interesting read. I wanted to thank you, Dr. W. Calvin Fields, for talking with me today, and God bless you, sir. Appreciate it.
Okay. Well, I enjoyed visiting with you.